Carl Jung discovered that emotional withdrawal isn't depression or isolation. It's the final psychological stage before you become who you truly are. If you've been pulling away from people, losing interest in social games, and feeling like nothing matters anymore, Jung found this isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. You're not falling apart, you're breaking free, and what comes next will transform everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. Picture this moment. You're sitting alone, feeling nothing. Friends text asking if you're okay. Family worries you're depressed. But you're not sad. You're just done. Done with small talk. Done with pretending. Done with relationships that feel like performance art. Something inside you has shifted, and you can't go back to caring about things that used to matter. This withdrawal feels wrong, because everything, in modern culture, tells you connection is everything. You're supposed to network, socialize, maintain relationships. The more friends you have, the more successful you are. But Jung discovered something that contradicts this entire worldview. Sometimes the most psychologically healthy thing you can do is withdraw completely. Not forever, but for a crucial period of transformation that most people never allow themselves to experience. Most people will tell you something is wrong with you. They'll suggest therapy, medication, or getting out more. But Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact phenomenon, and what he discovered changes everything. This withdrawal isn't a mental illness. It's what Jung called the final stage of individuation, the most important psychological transformation a human being can experience. You're not losing yourself. You're finally finding yourself. And the emptiness you feel right now is actually the fertile void where your authentic self is about to be born. Here's what Jung understood that most therapists miss. Your psyche has limited energy. To build what he called the true self, you must withdraw energy from the persona, the mask you wear for the world. This feels like dying, because in a very real sense your old identity is dying. But it's not destruction, it's resource reallocation. Your unconscious mind is pulling energy away from maintaining false relationships and fake versions of yourself, so it can invest that energy into something real. Jung discovered that society fundamentally misunderstands this process. When you withdraw emotionally, people call it isolation, avoidance, or depression. But Jung called it sacred detachment, a necessary separation from collective consciousness, so you can discover individual consciousness. You're not running away from life. You're running toward your life, the one you were meant to live before social conditioning told you who to be. Throughout his clinical work, Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. He documented how the psyche operates like an ecosystem with finite resources. When too much energy flows toward maintaining social masks and meeting external expectations, the authentic self starves. The withdrawal phase is the psyche's survival mechanism, shutting down non-essential operations to preserve what matters most. It's psychological triage, and it feels brutal because it is brutal. Think about a caterpillar entering its chrysalis. From the outside, it looks like death. The caterpillar dissolves into formless liquid, but that dissolution is necessary for transformation. Jung found that emotional withdrawal works the same way. Your old self must liquefy before your new self can form. The mistake is thinking the chrysalis stage should feel good. It doesn't. It feels like nothing, which terrifies people who've spent their whole lives feeling something, even if that something was anxiety, fear, or people-pleasing. What Jung discovered through decades of clinical observation is that this process can't be rushed or bypassed. The chrysalis stage takes as long as it takes. Some transformations happen in months, others require years. The duration depends on how deeply conditioned you were, how much false identity needs to dissolve, and how consciously you cooperate with the process. Fighting it extends the suffering. Surrendering to it allows natural unfolding. Let me show you the signs that this is happening to you. First, small talk becomes physically painful. You used to be able to chat about weather, weekend plans, and surface-level topics. Now, when someone starts that kind of conversation, you feel your energy drain, like water through a sieve. This isn't rudeness. Jung would say your psyche is rejecting empty exchanges because it desperately needs that energy for deeper work. Your unconscious mind knows it can't afford to waste resources on meaningless interaction. Jung identified this as what he called psychic economy. Just as your body conserves energy when you're sick, directing resources toward healing, your psyche conserves energy during individuation, directing resources toward transformation. Small talk isn't just boring anymore. It's actively painful because your system recognizes it as an energy drain you can no longer afford. Every minute spent discussing nothing is a minute stolen from the profound internal work your soul is trying to accomplish. Second, you stop blaming other people because you start seeing your own shadow. Jung's concept of the shadow is crucial here. It's all the parts of yourself you've rejected and projected onto others. When you judge someone as manipulative, you're often not seeing their manipulation. You're seeing your own unacknowledged capacity for manipulation reflected back at you. During this withdrawal phase, these projections start failing. You can't maintain the illusion that problems are out there anymore because you're starting to see that everything you've been fighting in the world exists inside you too. This makes drama boring. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. You used to get pulled into conflicts, gossip, and relationship chaos. Now it all seems like shadow theater, people fighting with externalized versions of their own internal struggles. You're not superior for seeing this. You're just conscious, and consciousness makes unconscious games impossible to play. This is why you feel so alone. Most people are still playing games you can no longer participate in. Jung observed that this shift in perception creates what he called psychological homesickness. You're homesick for a place you've never been, a way of living you've never experienced. You can feel it exists, but you don't know how to get there. The people around you seem content with surface-level existence, and you can't understand how they do it. You try to explain what you're experiencing, but the words never capture it. They think you're being negative or overthinking. But you're not overthinking. You're finally thinking at the depth required for authentic living. Consider a case profile that illustrates this dynamic perfectly. We see this clearly in someone who spent years convinced their co-workers were toxic and manipulative. They changed jobs repeatedly, always finding the same problems in new environments. But during their withdrawal phase, something shifted. They began recognizing that what they labeled as manipulation in others was actually their own rejected cunning, their own unacknowledged strategic thinking that they'd been taught to suppress. Once this awareness emerged, workplace drama lost its grip. They could finally see the patterns as universal human struggles rather than personal attacks. Third, you enter what Jung called the hermit phase, what he also described as the night sea journey. In mythology, the hero gets swallowed by a whale or descends into the underworld. They're cut off from the ordinary world, alone in darkness. Jung understood this isn't loneliness. It's solitude required for metamorphosis. You can't transform while maintaining all your old relationships and routines. You need isolation the way a seed needs darkness underground. Growth is happening where no one can see it, including you. The night sea journey terrified Jung's patients because it feels endless. You don't know how long this phase will last. Days, months, years. Jung found it varies completely based on how consciously you navigate the process. Some people resist so hard they extend their suffering indefinitely. Others learn to surrender to the dissolution, trusting something new will emerge. The key difference is whether you fight the withdrawal or cooperate with it. Jung documented that during this phase, you might experience strange psychological phenomena. Dreams become more vivid and symbolic. Synchronicities increase, meaningful coincidences that seem to guide you toward something. You develop what Jung called an active relationship with your unconscious. It's speaking to you through symbols, images, and intuitive knowing. Most people ignore these messages because they're trained to trust only rational thought. But Jung discovered that the unconscious contains wisdom the conscious mind can't access. Learning. Its language is essential for navigating the night sea journey successfully. Now, here's where this gets dangerous, and Jung was very clear about this danger. There's a moment when your persona breaks down completely. The mask you've worn to get approval, avoid rejection, and function in society suddenly stops working. You no longer have the energy to perform for others. You can't fake enthusiasm. You can't pretend to care about things that don't matter. You can't smile through conversations that feel like slow death. This persona breakdown is terrifying because you've confused the mask with your identity. When the mask cracks, you think you're cracking. But Jung discovered something remarkable. The real you has been suffocating under that mask your entire life. The breakdown isn't you falling apart. It's the false you, finally releasing its grip so the real, you can breathe. The panic you feel is actually the ego realizing it's not in control anymore. Something deeper is taking over, and your conscious mind doesn't trust it. Let's examine a narrative illustration that captures this experience. A composite example, based on commonly observed patterns, shows someone who built their entire identity around being helpful and agreeable. They were the person everyone called in a crisis, the reliable friend who never said no. But during their individuation process, they found themselves physically unable to maintain this role. When people asked for help, their body would tense up. When they tried to say yes, the word wouldn't come. This wasn't selfishness emerging. It was authenticity, finally demanding space. Their helpful persona had been a sophisticated defense mechanism, and now it was collapsing to reveal someone with needs, boundaries, and limitations they'd never acknowledged. Jung warned there's a crucial distinction to understand here, the difference between dissociation and individuation. Dissociation is escaping reality because you can't handle it. You disconnect from your body, your emotions, your life. Individuation is confronting reality so deeply that you withdraw from false versions of it. You're not leaving the world. You're leaving the illusion of the world that society has constructed. Dissociation is numbing. Individuation is awakening, even though awakening can feel exactly like numbness at first. How do you know which one you're experiencing? Jung said to look at what you're moving toward, not what you're moving away from. If you're withdrawing because everything overwhelms you and you want to feel nothing, that's dissociation. If you're withdrawing because surface-level existence no longer satisfies you and you're searching for something real, that's individuation. One is escape, the other is quest. Here's the controversy Jung addressed that most spiritual teachers ignore completely. What if you stay in this withdrawn state forever? What if the isolation never ends? What if your new self never emerges and you're just alone and empty until you die? Jung called this the shadow of withdrawal, the dark side of this necessary process. He warned that if you remain in the hermit phase too long without purpose, you risk two equally dangerous outcomes. First, ego inflation. You start thinking you're a god, that you've transcended human needs for connection and meaning. You become spiritually arrogant, looking down on people still trapped in unconscious patterns, while secretly you're just trapped in a different pattern. Spiritual bypassing dressed up as enlightenment. Jung saw this constantly in his clinical work. Individuals who use spiritual withdrawal to avoid the harder work of genuine human relationship. Second, total despair. You conclude that nothing matters, life is meaningless, and authentic connection is impossible. You give up, not dramatically, but quietly. You stop trying to find your people. You stop believing they exist. You settle into isolation, not as a temporary chrysalis, but as a permanent tomb. Jung called this psychological death without rebirth, the tragedy of someone who dissolved their old self, but never formed a new one. Jung documented these dangers extensively in his writings on individuation. He observed that the withdrawal phase contains an inherent risk, a razor's edge between transformation and stagnation. The difference lies in whether you maintain what he called tension with the opposites. You must hold the tension between solitude and connection, between death and rebirth, between letting go and reaching forward. If you collapse into one side, you get stuck. Ego inflation means you've collapsed into grandiosity. Total despair means you've collapsed into meaninglessness. True individuation requires holding both possibilities simultaneously until something new emerges from the tension. The goal Jung identified isn't to leave the world forever. It's to return changed. The withdrawal phase is temporary, a necessary death before resurrection. You go into the darkness not to stay there, but to retrieve something you left behind, your authentic self, your soul, your purpose. Then you bring it back to the world. You re-engage with life, but now you're connecting from your soul instead of your persona. The isolation ends, replaced by a deeper form of connection that doesn't drain you because it's real. So how do you survive this stage? How do you make sure it leads to rebirth instead of spiritual death? Jung developed a specific practice he called active waiting, or what Taoists call wu wei, effortless action. You don't force motivation. You don't create artificial goals to make yourself feel productive. You don't pressure yourself to have everything figured out. Instead, you wait actively, paying attention, staying present, listening for what wants to emerge. This is the hardest thing you'll ever do, because Western culture has trained you to always be doing something. Waiting feels like wasting time. But Jung discovered that the psyche works on its own schedule. You can't rush individuation the same way you can't rush a seed to sprout by pulling on it. You create the conditions for growth, and then you trust the process. The conditions are silence, solitude, and self-honesty. The process is allowing your authentic self to emerge without forcing it into a predetermined shape. During this active waiting, you practice what Jung called self-observation, without judgment. You notice what genuinely interests you without immediately turning it into a goal or career plan. Maybe you find yourself drawn to walking in nature. You don't analyze why or make it a fitness routine. You just walk. Maybe you feel called to create something. You don't worry about whether it's good enough to share. You just create. These authentic impulses are your soul speaking, and it speaks in whispers, not commands. Jung taught that the soul has its own intelligence, separate from ego intelligence. The ego wants to plan, control, and optimize. The soul wants to express, explore, and experience. During withdrawal, the ego is weakening and the soul is strengthening. This power transfer feels uncomfortable because you've been ego-identified your entire life. Learning to trust soul guidance requires faith in something you can't see or measure. But Jung found that people who develop this trust emerge from withdrawal with unshakable purpose. Jung found that soul motivation operates completely differently from ego motivation. Ego motivation feels urgent and anxious. It says you must do this or something bad will happen. Soul motivation feels calm and magnetic. It says you get to do this because it's what you are. Ego motivation depletes you. Soul motivation energizes you. The withdrawal phase is teaching you to distinguish between these two types of impulses. It's killing ego motivation, so soul motivation can finally be heard. Jung identified several key characteristics that distinguish soul motivation from ego-driven impulses. Soul motivation is seasonal, coming in waves and cycles rather than being constantly available. Forcing it leads to spiritual exhaustion. It's collaborative, working with life circumstances instead of trying to control them. It finds the path of least resistance rather than pushing against obstacles. It's mysterious, often not revealing its purpose until after you follow the calling. And most importantly, it's sustainable because it emerges from your authentic nature and generates energy rather than depleting it. A narrative illustration helps clarify this distinction. Consider a case profile that Jung would have recognized immediately. We observe someone who built their life around external achievement, climbing corporate ladders and accumulating credentials. After a spiritual awakening, that entire motivational structure disappeared. For months, they felt nothing toward their career, but slowly, different impulses emerged. A pull toward creative work, an interest in mentoring others, a need for solitude in nature that felt less recreational and more essential. These weren't strategic career moves. They were soul callings, emerging from depth, and following them felt like remembering rather than discovering. Here's what happens after the withdrawal, if you navigate it consciously. You return to relationships, but everything has changed. You're no longer performing. You're no longer people-pleasing. You're no longer accepting connections that require you to betray yourself. Some relationships will end because they were based on false versions of you. This will hurt, but it's necessary. Jung called this the sacrifice of the unlived life, releasing who you pretended to be so you can become who you actually are. But new relationships become possible. Connections Jung called soul level rather than persona level. You meet people who don't need you to wear a mask. They're attracted to your authenticity, not your performance. These relationships feel completely different. They're energizing instead of draining. They're spacious instead of clingy. They allow silence instead of demanding constant interaction. You finally understand what Jung meant when he said, true relationship requires two individuated people who have found themselves before trying to find each other. Jung observed that individuated people recognize each other instantly. There's a quality of presence, a depth of being that can't be faked. When you meet another person who has been through their own night sea journey, the connection is immediate and profound. You don't need to explain yourself. They understand the terrain you've crossed because they've crossed it too. These are your true people, the ones you've been searching for your entire life, but you couldn't recognize them until you became one of them. The shift in relational capacity after individuation is profound. Jung noted that before this transformation, most people relate through mutual projections and shared personas. They connect over shared masks rather than authentic selves. After individuation, this becomes impossible. You can't participate in persona-level connection anymore because your persona has dissolved. This is why so many relationships end during this phase. They weren't real relationships. They were agreements between masks. And when your mask disappears, the agreement becomes void. The work you end up doing also transforms. Before individuation, most people choose careers based on external metrics like money, status, or parental approval. After individuation, you choose based on internal alignment. Jung called this incarnated purpose, when your authentic essence finds expression through your human life. You're not trying to become successful. You're allowing what wants to emerge through you to take form in the world. The difference is subtle, but life-changing. Jung emphasized that incarnated purpose doesn't necessarily look impressive from the outside. You might not become famous or wealthy. You might not change the world in obvious ways, but you'll be living in alignment with your deepest nature, which Jung believed is the only success that truly matters. The people around you might not understand your choices. They might think you're wasting your potential by choosing meaning over money. But you'll know something they don't. You'll know what it feels like to live a life that's actually yours. Jung emphasized this isn't about finding your passion or discovering your calling through logical analysis. You can't think your way to authentic purpose. You can only live your way into it. The withdrawal phase is creating space for purpose to find you. When this happens, motivation becomes effortless because you're no longer swimming against the current of your own nature. But Jung warned about romanticizing this process. Living from soul purpose requires tremendous courage because it often leads you away from conventional success metrics. You might make less money, you might receive less recognition. Jung called this the sacrifice of the golden ego, releasing attachment to external validation in favor of internal alignment. The ultimate insight Jung offers about post-withdrawal life is this. The emptiness you're experiencing isn't the absence of purpose. It's the presence of purpose so authentic that your ego can't recognize it. Your old motivations had to die because they were keeping you from discovering what Jung called the life that wants to live through you. Everything that's been stripped away had to go, not because you failed, but because you succeeded in outgrowing a version of yourself that was never truly you. The awakening didn't kill your motivation completely. It killed your limitations. What feels like loss is liberation. What feels like the end is the beginning. Your assignment, in Jung's framework, is to practice conscious waiting. Spend time each day asking yourself what wants to emerge through you. Then listen without judgment to whatever arises. Trust that your unconscious knows what it's doing, even when your conscious mind doesn't understand the process. Remember what Jung discovered through decades of research. Authentic purpose can't be figured out. It can only be lived into. You're not broken for losing motivation after awakening. You're being prepared for motivation so authentic and powerful that it will transform not just your life, but everyone your life touches. Jung's final insight is both challenging and liberating. The emptiness following spiritual awakening is temporary but necessary. It's the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Most people can't tolerate this space. They rush to fill it with new goals, relationships, or identities. But Jung discovered that people who learn to sit in the emptiness emerge as something entirely new. This is what Jung meant by individuation. Not improvement or optimization, but becoming the real version of yourself, the one that was buried under years of social programming. The withdrawal phase is your psyche's way of hitting the reset button. So if you're in this phase right now, feeling empty and withdrawn, Jung would tell you this: you're exactly where you need to be. The darkness is preparation. The isolation is purposeful and necessary. Something in you knows the life you were living wasn't your life. Trust the process. Honor the emptiness. Your authentic self is coming. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.